Welcome, everyone, to the Information's TITV. My name is Akash Pasricha. It is Wednesday, July 29th. Today on the show, we have a scoop on ChatGPT's latest user data. We're also going to unpack an in-depth profile that my colleague wrote on Reflection AI, an up-and-coming AI lab. And we're going to close out the show with Jeetu Patel, the president of Cisco. The company has joined forces with dozens of others on the Open Secure AI Alliance. We'll talk about his views on AI safety and open source AI altogether. It's going to be a great show, so let's get right on into it. The Information has exclusive reporting on ChatGPT's latest user data. I want to bring on Stephanie Palazzolo, author of our AI Agenda newsletter, to walk us through what she found. Stephanie, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Great to be on.
Okay, how many active users does ChatGPT currently have?
So, as my colleague Aaron and I reported last night, ChatGPT is right on the verge of hitting 1 billion weekly active users. So, again, this is the number of users that are using the popular chatbot at least once a week. The reason why it's a little bit hazy is because, typically whenever companies are keeping track of these numbers, they do have to do some kind of last minute counting for like bot accounts and things like that. But it does seem if they haven't hit it already, it's, on track to hit that number in the next couple days.
So when were they expecting to hit that initially?
So, obviously that's kind of the important point here. 1 billion is a super impressive number. That's a huge proportion of the world's population that is logging into ChatGPT and using it at least once a week. But the important thing is that the company originally was hoping to hit this milestone at the end of last year or by the end of last year. So, it does come around 7 months after the company was originally hoping to hit that usage number.
And so what's been the issue? Do we know?
So I think there's a couple things that are coming into play here. I think first, as Sam Altman told staff at the end of 2025, at this point, Google was really starting to do well. Gemini was really catching on with developers. Sam told staff, let's we're going to expect kind of rough vibes and
Yeah,
more.
code red. I mean, it was, you broke that story. Code red, things are not looking great for ChatGPT, and then what?
Exactly. So, lots of worries about Google. Then since then, Google maybe hasn't been as much of a threat, although definitely is obviously a very big competitor. People are using its AI tools more than ever through Google search AI mode. But since then, Anthropic has really caught on. So its coding tools, like Claude Code, are doing incredibly well. Lots of people are using, Anthropic's Claude chatbot and its other AI tools. And so, I think both of those, just basically rising competition as well as a kind of slowdown that we've previously written about that happened after OpenAI's GPT-5 launch last year. These are all contributing factors to why it's been maybe harder than expected for OpenAI to pass that last, 100 million or so in users and why it took them, much longer than expected to.
What about paying users? I mean, nearly a billion in weekly active users. We know that you can log on for free and use it. What proportion of that are people that are paying for the platform right now? And how does that compare to the proportion of paying users for all these other platforms as well?
So it's a little hard to say because obviously a lot of this data is kept very much under wraps by all these startups. But the last figure that we've written about is that ChatGPT, there's more than 50 million people that are paying to use the chatbot. So relatively like a small proportion of people are paying, which is maybe not great for OpenAI. I'm sure they'd love to increase that proportion. However, it's also important to point out that they have other ways to monetize non-paying users, like ads, for instance, which is something that they have been trying to push more into in recent months. Um, it does seem like, from our reporting that this does seem to be kind of a higher proportion of paid users than some other AI tools, though.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, ChatGPT is certainly one business vertical that the company has. We also know that Codex has been gaining steam. And so I wonder if you've heard of the company really shifting its priorities at all in terms of prioritizing growth in other areas where ChatGPT growth might end up, and I don't want to say stalling. I mean, look, it's still growing fast. I mean, look, any platform to have, 1/8 of the world's population, uh, I don't know how many people are they can expect, but have there been growth in other areas of the business to compensate?
Yeah, so this has been a really big theme for OpenAI in the last year or so. So, as ChatGPT growth has kind of slowed and tapered off a bit, we have seen the company really double down more on selling AI to enterprises, as well as tools for coding and knowledge work, things like Codex and more recently ChatGPT work. So you can kind of see them trying their hand at the Anthropic playbook here and being, you know, much more focused these days on selling AI to enterprises because that's an area that maybe they haven't tapped into as much. And obviously enterprises are maybe much more willing to pay for AI tools than the average consumer is. So far, we have done some reporting on this. It seems to be going well. I have talked to a decent number of developers who have switched over, for instance, from Claude Code to Codex in recent months as OpenAI's models have gotten better, and especially as they have proven to be, in many cases, a lot cheaper than Anthropic's models. But at the same time, it still is very much a super tight race, and right now it is very much neck and neck, and it's not clear if OpenAI is going to be able to, you know, match or surpass Anthropic when it comes to kind of AI for enterprises.
And remind us, I mean, Sarah Fryer had some comments about this earlier this year where she sees the future of the business in terms of revenue breakdowns. She, of course, is the CFO of OpenAI. What did she say with her expectations there?
So earlier this year in January, Sarah Fryer did say that around 40% of the company's revenue was coming from businesses, and she expected that proportion to grow to 50% by the end of the year. So that is obviously a very significant chunk of the business that is coming from enterprises, which I think even in January, that was, somewhat surprising for people who had mostly seen OpenAI as this, very consumer focused business. Um, but I think at the same
And
time,
and it kinda goes to the point that you were saying earlier, which is that, although they've fallen short of this metric, which is very much it's a consumer-focused metric, maybe inside OpenAI, I mean, where they started with Code Red, maybe it doesn't actually matter to them as much because, at the end of the day, I mean, it's businesses that's gonna help, get them to profitability, and you shouldn't ignore it, but I'm just saying in terms of converting it to revenue, if it's only 5% of people who are paying for it, probably not the highest ROI to focus on that necessarily.
totally. I think that's super fair. And we do see, OpenAI even now moving away from this kind of just like kind of simpler chatbot product where you're just going back and forth with a chatbot and more into things like ChatGPT work and Codex, where you see their products, basically completing actions on the user's behalf, which is very, attractive to enterprises who want to like automate things like payroll or sending emails or scheduling, right? So all these things are definitely much more targeted at the enterprise, side of the business.
Right. Steph, before we let you go, I want to get into very quickly another story that you published with Amir Afradi, our co-executive editor. You did some analysis today on the Stripe OpenRouter acquisition that everyone is expecting to happen. We, of course, have reported that $10 billion is the price tag that they are considering. You took a look at the valuation and what that means in terms of multiples. What did you find there?
So, yeah, I think this is one of the most, potentially expensive acquisitions that we've seen in quite a while. So, as my colleague Amir and I reported last night, or sorry, earlier this morning, OpenRouter, which is the startup that basically helps developers choose between a bunch of different open and closed source models, um, was recently generating around 140 million in annualized sales. So, obviously that's not nothing, but it's a far cry from, the billions of dollars that we see other, application and infrastructure companies making. I think what makes that really surprising though is comparing that 140 million number to the, around 10 billion price tag that we've reported on. So comparing those two numbers, that means that if the deal goes through, Stripe is going to be paying more than 70 times OpenRouter's um, revenue, which is, quite expensive, especially whenever you compare that to other recent deals like SpaceX and Cursor, where, Cursor was not only making significantly more revenue, but when we compare to the price tag, that ended up being more around a 22 times revenue multiple, a lot lower than what Stripe.
Nearly 3 times as much as Cursor on a multiples basis, which is kind of crazy, especially when you consider that the Cursor deal was that's $60 billion was a big check to begin with there. What do you think is accounting for the premium here? What does Stripe see in OpenRouter?
So I think there's one element of this, which is just that, um,
Are you gonna say
not
FOMO? Are you gonna say
there's
FOMO?
there's probably a bit of FOMO. I think, as we reported, it does seem like there were a lot of buyers around the table. Databricks is a name that we have written about. It does seem like there were at least a couple others. So definitely there can be a situation where, with M&A, I don't think everything is very rational where it's like, we can attribute this part of the price to like this value that we're getting. I think, companies and buyers are bidding each other up. So I think that could definitely be like an element that was happening here. I think on the other hand, Stripe obviously is involved in, payments. It has a good kind of insight into what its customers are paying for AI models. And I think OpenRouter could be a nice complement to that business where, not only are they handling like payments and seeing, that data on what businesses are spending on AI models, but now they can also get into the business of like helping those customers choose which AI models they want to use when. And I think it could be, a nice way for Stripe to add this kind of AI flair to its narrative, which I think every company wants to have these days. And as some of my other colleagues have written about, it does seem like they have a pretty hefty, war chest of cash, and they need somewhere to kind of put that cash, and M&A is always a good place to do that.
So can I just ask you one question though? I mean, you wrote about the risks to OpenRouter's growth and the sustainability of their revenue in the story, and I want you to sort of share with us what those risks are. But more importantly, if Stripe buys OpenRouter, then it really becomes a game of pointing that technology to all of Stripe's customers. And so, after explaining to us the risks, I want you to then opine on whether or not you think the Stripe acquisition could sort of nullify those risks, or maybe mitigate them in sort of a joint union of sorts.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the risks, I mean, there's a couple things here. I think first, um, there's been a lot of skepticism around businesses like OpenRouter, which are essentially, helping developers choose between existing open source models and, existing open and closed source models, and providing this kind of centralized hub that makes it easier for them to pick and choose and do that all in kind of one place. I think some people would argue though that, how much value really is a company like OpenRouter adding to that process? And at the end of the day, some people might even describe them as just kind of reselling other companies' APIs. So I think initially it's kind of maybe not entirely clear what the value add is there. I think another issue too is that from our reporting, a lot of customers are using OpenRouter to access, for instance, closed source and Anthropic models that are out there. And, Anthropic has definitely not been shy about, cutting off access to its models to companies that it feels like maybe are somehow using those models in an unfair way. So,
Or
you know,
pointing them elsewhere, basically saying, "Hey, like, we're giving you access to this model, but OpenRouter is saying it's actually not the model you should use. Why would Anthropic even allow access then in that case?"
Yeah, and, Anthropic can also say, "Hey, why don't these customers just come directly to us? Why are they going through this, like, weird third party that is reselling our models?" Right? Like,
Right.
Anthropic is kind of just leaving money on the table here. So, in that case, I do think, like, Stripe is not gonna be much help there because
No,
what are
not
they
at
gonna
all. I
do to
mean,
prevent Anthropic?
these are
Yeah.
still like, there's the business of routing is doesn't really matter how big. In fact, I mean, you can even argue the bigger the owner of the company, and yeah, I'm just brainstorming here. I mean, Stripe is in the payments category. Anthropic doesn't really have much in the payments layer, but to the extent that they ever start to compete on anything, the risk seems even more likely in that case.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. So, I do agree with you that I think Stripe will provide a lot of distribution benefits, and obviously Stripe has a huge base of customers, which I'm sure OpenRouter would love to have access to, but definitely has yet to be seen whether they're going to be able to help with any of those risks. It seems like maybe not with at least some of those issues.
But the bankers love it. The bankers do love
Yeah.
a good $10 billion deal.
Yeah, I know. It was pretty crazy to see the kind of discourse after we first broke that news. And just because, again, the company was last valued at around 1 billion. And so that's a
Yeah,
great outcome for the company's founders, for its employees, and definitely for the VCs that backed it at a much lower price. So firms like Andreessen and Menlo Ventures that got in way earlier.
right. Great. Well, Stephanie, I want to thank you for coming on. That is Stephanie Palazzolo, author of our AI Agenda newsletter here on TITV. Reflection AI is an up and coming AI lab with a lot of momentum. It has raised billions of dollars from investors, $800 million from Nvidia alone. It is just one of 8 AI companies to sign a deal with the Defense Department, joining Google, Microsoft, and AWS. And yet, it hasn't yet released a model to the public. Our AI and robotics reporter, Rocket Drew, profiled the company in a story out today. I want to bring on Rocket to share more with us about what he found. Rocket, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Akash. Great to be here.
Why did you decide to laser in on reflection specifically?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you just said. There were all of these buzzy announcements that mentioned the company, including ones from the Department of Defense, where Reflection is standing shoulder to shoulder with these giants, these heavyweights in AI. But Reflection is comparatively not well known at all. So that got us thinking, what is it about this startup that's getting them so much traction? They're signing these big deals and they have these big ambitions for themselves. We wanted to know a little bit more about the company.
And I want to get into the backstory of the company, but one of the most surprising things in your reporting that shocked me was you found that I mean the model that they're developing, it's expected to be quite good, right?
Yeah, that's right. But good relative to the open weight models that are available in the US. So it is still the case that Chinese models are pretty far ahead of the open weight models that are available from developers in the US. At the time Reflection comes out with its model will likely be on par for Western models, but not for Chinese models. Of course, they hope to exceed Chinese models in the future. Uh, the point is more.
Western open source models, to be clear.
That's right, that's right. Western
Okay.
open source models, to be clear. So not the models you're seeing from OpenAI and Anthropic, but instead from companies like Mistral, from Thinking Machines Labs, which got into the game recently with their pretty large model Inkling, and then also smaller models that have come out recently, like one from Poolside. They have a model called Laguna that's specialized for coding. So the point is that while Anthropic has these ambitions and they are tracking to be on the Western frontier, every day that goes by, it feels like there's more competition. There are more models out there that are available, even from Western open source companies. So Reflection has better come out with a model soon if that's if they're still tracking to be on the frontier.
Right. Um, I want you to walk us through the history of this company. The co-founders, Misha Laskin and Giannis Antonopoulos. I think I
That's right.
pronounced that right. Hopefully, Giannis. Please correct me. Come on the show and correct me if you will. Tell me about these founders and why they are so popular in the AI ecosystem right now.
Yeah, absolutely. They definitely bring with them a certain AI pedigree, especially because they both worked at Google DeepMind and they got a lot of experience there. So, um, Giannis was one of the people who worked on AlphaGo, which was the pioneering reinforcement learning system. They taught an AI to play Go, which was once thought to be a game too complex for any machine to ever play, let alone master. And then in 2016, it dethroned the reigning world champion. It was a coup really for AI progress. It blew people away. So that's what Giannis brings to the table, and that experience he has with reinforcement learning is really attractive for Reflection, bringing in new talent. Understandably, people are excited to work with him. Misha also worked at DeepMind and cut his teeth working on the earliest versions of the Gemini models. So he brings in some more of that experience with large language models. So together they have some star power on the founding team for sure.
And what was the original ambition for the company when they started it?
Well, I think at the very beginning, maybe they didn't really know. Talking to some people who were working with them in the early days, they were trying a lot of things. There
Smart
were
people will do smart things. Let's
exactly.
give them money.
Right, right. The classic Neolab proposition. And in fact, I think that's one of the things that's interesting about them is there's been kind of this moment for Neolabs lately, but in some ways, Reflection was early to this game, realizing that there's probably room to get in and compete against these larger players like OpenAI and Anthropic. But to begin with, Reflection saw its angle as coding. I mean, if you'll remember, a couple years ago, coding, Cursor was on the rise. Coding was such a hot topic already. Their first product that they ever released was an agent for understanding existing code. So, not for writing code, but just for understanding code. But that
Hmm.
was not a model that they trained themselves in house, soup to nuts, right? That's sort of an entirely different proposition. So, what happened was the company then made a dramatic pivot and decided that they were going to train their own models from scratch and they were going to open source those models. And in fact, they were going to be the champion of open source in the US. And that pivot happened after Misha met with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang a year ago out here in California. So Jensen floated the idea, and then they made this big pivot essentially overnight and changed the strategy of the company. A year later, the model still hasn't come out. So that's what we're waiting on now.
Do we have any sense for what Jensen said in this meeting to convince Misha on what frankly is now, I mean, as of today at least, it's one of the most competitive battlegrounds for models is the open source model category. Do we know what Jensen said to
It-
convince him to
yeah.
change the whole strategy?
It is very competitive. Now, we don't know for sure, but what you should remember is that it's absolutely in NVIDIA's interest to have more players in this category, right? The more companies that are out there using AI, the wider variety of companies, the more revenue they can bring in for their AI chips. And also, it helps diversify their revenue away from these large concentrated players like OpenAI and Anthropic, AI companies that are increasingly developing their own chips as alternatives to NVIDIA's. So, um, you can see why it would be in NVIDIA's interest to have a player like Reflection out there. You also have to remember that a year ago, the territory did seem more open. Like DeepSeek had happened, but there weren't a ton of players yet, even on the China side, that were competing at that level in open source AI. So um, it still seemed, I think, more like it was anyone's for the taking. Now, to be sure, there's still a lot of room for Reflection to get in and compete in this market. Um,
Right.
it's been working on the
But
model for a year. It could release a frontier model, and models they're not all the same. It could find a niche that works for it very well. But I think the proposition was probably something along those lines that there's a lot of room for an open source US champion, and if that company has our backing, has the compute that it needs from NVIDIA, they're basically going to be set.
But I mean, let's get to the heart of it. I mean, they've raised so much money. They haven't yet been able to release a model. And I should say, I'm saying they haven't been able to. It might be it likely is a decision, right? I mean, we've talked on this show about timing too. It matters. If Kimi K3 just came out, people are raving about it. You better make sure maybe not competitive with Kimi K3, but at least competitive with the Western open source model. So
Mhm.
maybe it's a strategic decision to not release it yet. But I mean, what do we know about what's happening inside the company? Have they been making traction with their model? What are experts expecting? Because they have all these deals with the Defense Department, with Dell, et cetera, on the surface. What's going on underneath the hood?
Yeah, that's right. There is definitely progress on the model that's going on inside. And from what I can gather, people inside are optimistic about the progress. But I should say, it's not always. Sometimes there's this timing game where the longer you wait, the better a model you'll release. But I think often the considerations favor releasing a model basically as soon as it's good enough to release. One of the reasons for that is you'll start getting more traction with people. And especially in open source, one of the things you're really betting on is that you will win the loyalty of developers and people who like to download the model and tinker with it. So earlier is better. And also compared to open source, there's another factor that heavily favors releasing the model as soon as possible. And that's that with a closed model, when you release the model, all of a sudden a lot of your computing resources are going to serving that model and providing inference for your customers. But with
Right.
open source models, you don't have to worry about that, right? You can just keep on training the next generation because your customers and your users will basically run the model on their own computing infrastructure rather than
So for
requiring
open
you.
source, it's actually better to get it out there sooner, even more than closed
Yeah, I
source.
think you basically want to release it as soon as possible. Now, in Reflection's case, you should remember they signed a couple large computing deals, but only recently. So they have this massive deal to rent compute from SpaceX. They've also signed a really large deal to get compute from Nebius. These deals are worth billions of dollars potentially over the next several years, but
Yeah.
those deals were announced recently. So I've heard that there's some jockeying for compute internally between different teams. At least there was before these deals were signed. That's standard. That's par for the course with any like AI company these days, and especially Neolabs. But you could hope that now that the compute is available, that makes it easier to sort of full steam ahead work on the model.
So then is it the compute jockeying that's the reason they haven't released it then, or
Well,
what is the core reason?
it just takes time. I mean, you certainly need a lot of compute to train
Yeah,
a frontier model,
right.
but it just takes time. There's a lot of experiments that have to be run to figure out how can we scale up a model and eventually train one in one big training run that is frontier quality. And there's a lot of infrastructure work and engineering that goes into that. And they're building it from scratch, right? Like if, at a company like OpenAI or Anthropic, they have all of this code, they have all of this software built up, and they have all of the results. Like they have experiments from how the training the models pans out. But in practice, there's a lot of art that goes into it, a lot of craft figuring out what works.
Right, right. And I mean, look, we should say that the fact that that expert and you talk to third party experts as well, not just people um, associated with the company. I mean, they also are expecting big things from this model. So I'm excited to see where it all goes and what happens with it. Rocket, I want to thank you for coming on. It's a great story. That is Rocket Drew, our AI and robotics reporter here at The Information.
Thanks, Kosh.
You might remember earlier this week, we talked about a bunch of companies signing the Open Secure AI Alliance. This was dozens of companies coming together to say we are prioritizing cybersecurity and open source in AI. There were a bunch of companies on that list: Microsoft, Palantir, Nvidia, Uber, ServiceNow, Salesforce. Cisco was another company that put their name to it. And I want to bring on Jeetu Patel, President and Chief Product Officer of the company, for his view on all this. Jeetu, welcome to the show. It's great to have you back.
Oh yeah, Coach. Good to see you, man.
Good. How you been?
I've been great. There's never a dull moment where we
Never a
live.
dull moment indeed. So
Yeah.
much has changed, and yet the game is still very much similar to when we last spoke. I want to ask you about this alliance that Cisco signed on to. Tell me about the decision to attach your name to it.
Well, here's the way I've always thought about security. The true enemy is not the competitor. The true enemy is the adversary. And so I think what we have to do is make sure that there's as much sharing of information and as much kind of collaborating that happens within the industry so that we can make sure that we have a secure posture against the adversary. Now, when the adversary is both humans as well as agents that can come in at machine scale, you need to make sure that you've got the right level of apparatus to go out and combat have the defenses at machine scale as well. So it didn't take that much kind of calculus on our side to say, yeah, open source is a good thing. In fact,
Yeah.
we've been promoting open source now for the past, I don't know, a couple of years. We had the foundation security model that we had launched, I think 18 months ago or something. And so it just seems like it's a very natural progression as you move forward. And given the cost of these models and the token consumption getting so high, having smaller models that are purpose built for specific domains, for specific tasks that can be available in the open source community is just good for everyone.
So, you talk about adversaries and security and how open source enables that. Dario at Anthropic, I'm going to read you a quote that he put in his letter that he put out. He said, I don't agree with the letter's assertions that open weights models necessarily make it easier to develop safeguards or that broad access to capabilities necessarily helps defenders more than attackers. He, of course, is referring to the letter that was released prior to the alliance that you signed on to. But I mean, his point is basically that he doesn't agree necessarily that open source AI necessarily means more safety. What do you think of that?
So I think this is an area that I wish the market had more tolerance for nuance. And I think what Dario is coming up with is specific arguments that are actually very credible arguments. They aren't worth throwing out of the window. And I think there's very, very credible counter arguments that are worth considering as well. And what we end up doing, and if you look right now at the social media sphere, there is a very, very polarized debate on this rather than one which is stemmed on intellectual curiosity.
Right. So, well, what are the new? I mean, walk us through the nuanced arguments for and against.
So, nuances on having an open source model is, firstly, you want to make sure that an open weights model specifically, rather than just open sources, there's 3 dimensions that you want to keep in mind. There's intelligence, cost, and control. Okay. So the first one is intelligence. Is the model going to be effective enough to go out and do the task that you wanted to do in the most economic way possible,
right?
While providing you the most amount of control. And in some cases, you don't care about control. In other cases, you might really care about control. And so you want to make sure that in some cases, you want to just make sure that your model is running in your data center, not just, and I don't want to go out and support, RSI and recursive self-improvement for another model and provide my data over there. So it's not just for security models, for any model.
Right.
You might want to make sure that there's a place for, open source and open weights models. I, by the way, as a side note, actually believe that the United States should have a strong stance on open source. I think companies like Nvidia and Nemotron are doing a great job, and we need more and more. Thinking Machines, Mira Murati has done a good job on just coming out with one, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah,
and,
with Inkling, right?
Yep, and full disclosure, we are investors in Mira's company. But I think in general, it is a great thing to have closed source models and open source models. There's no downside in having open source models in America. Okay.
Right. So
Now,
go back to the nuances. So we were talking about arguments for and against the nuanced pieces.
Yeah. So the for and against on the nuance of open source models is like, if I have an open source model, I'm going to be able to reduce my cost. Because, like, for example, we did Antares, right? We just launched Antares. We have 2 models, 350 million parameters and a billion parameter model, which is minuscule, tiny compared to frontier class models. In some particular domains, it's actually performing pretty well in benchmarks. And that domain that we have actually focused on is finding existing vulnerabilities in code that you have. Finding the vulnerabilities that currently exist, not 0-day, but existing vulnerabilities in code that you have, which typically comprises for, a non-trivial amount of exploits that happen. We want to make sure that we provide a very, very efficient way to do it and find those vulnerabilities so you could patch them. Having that available in the open source community, there's no downside to it. There's zero downside to having that.
Because so what about the nuanced arguments against open source then? Where does Dario have a point here with the credible arguments?
Against open source, he's like, everyone's going to have it. I'm going to have guardrails in my models, and I'm going to make sure that those guardrails can actually be done in a way that bad actors can't go out and use that open source against us. That's the argument, against it. It's not a terrible argument. Now, by the way, if you look at what happened with OpenAI and Hugging Face actually used open source models because the guardrails weren't working to go out and kind of save that. Yeah. So these are not like simple positions. And by the way, when you start thinking about policy positions that you apply to it, they get even more complicated and even more nuanced in what happens if you banned Chinese open source in the US, then what happens? Well, now the cost of tokens and the cost of going out and performing intelligent tasks in the US goes up compared to the rest of the world. That then over the long period of time might actually put us at a disadvantage. If you keep it open, you could have a model that has actually been trained to go create some harm on our on US soil. So like there's a bunch of these things that we have to just think about very carefully and have the assessment done with the level of nuance that's factored in. I just don't think that culturally we need to start vilifying one party or the other. I have a ton of respect for Dario.
No,
I think
and look,
because
I think I'm actually more interested in the nuances of the argument, and so
I
that's
just gave you one of those, right?
no,
It's
yeah, and I think it's a good point. One of the nuances that I've been asking folks about on this show is with respect to government regulation, specifically whether or not they think the government should have a role in reviewing the models, at least for these frontier closed source models, as we've seen happen in the past. Should the government have a role in reviewing them before they get released? And I guess on one hand you could say, what it's slowing the pace of development. On the other hand, you say it's safer. So I wonder, where do you fall on that issue? Should they have a role in reviewing the models?
so. By the way, and this is a the ability for the government to say, if this affects national security materially, I want to be able to intercept, should always be something that the government has preserved as a right for them. I feel like it's good for the country. It's good for national security. It's good for the citizens of the country. Now, is their reviewing of the model going to have the level of efficacy to be able to find things that would have not been found otherwise, is the thing that you have to think about. And is it better for the government to review the models? Is it better for a third-party agency that actually gets specialized in doing that reviews the models, that the government makes sure that they require for some kind of check before they move forward? Those are all aspects that need to be considered. But if you look back at the first principles and the core intent is, I want to be able to make sure, as the government of the United States, that I have a degree of control of what I put out in the open market. If there is a national security risk that I want to be able to make sure that I can opine on, that is a perfectly normal thing to do in situations like this. And you can't just be a dogmatic free market player. On the other hand, you have to make sure that that actually provides the efficacy that's needed and doesn't slow down the market unnecessarily just for bureaucracy. And those are the two things that you have to consider.
So you mentioned Chinese open source models. Are you using Kimi K3 at Cisco right now with your products?
We are not right now. We
Okay.
have a fair amount of,
Are you using any Chinese open source
We're not right
models?
now. Cisco is not using Chinese open source models today.
Right.
We've
Why
decided right
not?
now that that's because we've decided right now that we want to see how it plays out first. Look, we are critical infrastructure for the critical infrastructure of the world. Like, if something goes wrong with us, and hospitals get breached, and power plants get breached, and all of the critical infrastructure gets breached, lives are lost, right? And so we want to make sure that we're extremely careful on. I mean, what is the big benefit? The Chinese models haven't gone and said, I'm going to provide you with more capability than what a frontier class model is saying. I'm going to provide you with something that's going to be comparable and just as good as. And then the only thing is economics. I would rather take the risk on the economics rather than take the risk on safety of the country. And so we don't know what it is. That doesn't mean that we don't think that Chinese models should be used within the US. In fact, 60% of the inference volume in the US actually happens to be Chinese open source models. Is a source that is someone who told me that stat. I haven't verified that stat, but it's
I'd love to know the source of that. Yeah, that's staggering if that's true.
If it is true, it's a pretty staggering stat, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's a very interesting stat is 60%, also a 60% number, but not going. It was completely coincidental and had nothing to do with each other. Of the entire compute capacity now is actually shifted to inference, not to training.
Right.
Now, here's the nuanced area that I, Akash, really want to kind of make sure that we game theory out fully. Let's say that we go full-fledged and use the Chinese models, right? And if we do that,
I mean,
and
tomorrow, yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What were you saying?
Sorry, I thought are you asking me if I use them?
No, I'm just saying that if we as a country and as the world, everyone's starting to use a lot of Chinese models, which they are getting a tremendous amount of momentum from. By the way, they need to be commended on how quickly they've actually come up to speed, especially given that chip's disadvantage.
Right.
And so assume that actually ends up being the case. The one thing that you don't want to have happen is we have to think through the economic model of open source. And I believe strongly, like I couldn't be more emphatic about this. The US has to have many, many open source alternatives for frontier class models, as well as SLMs and kind of further downstream for open source and open weights models. But if that were to happen, there is a risk that we should actually provide the calculus on, which is right now it costs about $3 to $5 billion to train a frontier class model. That cost continues to keep going up. The only reason that they can justify putting that level of money to do the primary research to go out and train frontier class models is because it provides economic value on the other end of it. If that model gets disrupted, one, we have to think about what does that do for ongoing research. I actually believe that we are still in the very early days of model evolution, and I think we need to make sure that we continue to keep having greater and greater models that are built out to have the right levels of intelligence to be able to get done all the things that we want to get done with AI. And
Right.
so we do have to figure out, like, if open source disrupts closed source models, and if open source is largely has one of the vehicles that's used as distillation, then what happens to the closed source models that are actually pumping a lot of money into this to continue? And I mean, right now in the short term, none of that changes. But
Right.
in the long term, those economics could change. And so we have to think carefully about what do we do over there as well to make sure that there's enough fuel in the fire for open source so that open source models can do that frontier class research.
Well, and I think you're hitting on the exact question that we've been trying to think about is what then happens to the closed source AI labs then in a world where, I mean, you said this, the 60% was the it wasn't open source, it was the Chinese models, I think that you said. But I mean, in a world where open
I
source,
don't even know if that status is correct. by the way,
right.
but
So maybe
yeah.
we'll put that stat aside for a second.
Yeah.
But in a world where open source becomes a higher proportion of the model use, I mean, that's the question then, and I wonder what you think the answer is. Like, what happens to the closed source model labs as a business?
So I think the way that the business model will evolve is the monetization, in my mind, would then move towards the app layer as well as the infrastructure layer, right? They would cut costs on the infrastructure side by going out and doing more efficient, kind of build out over there. Like they're making their own chips and XPUs, and those actually really help with actually, the trimming
Yeah.
down of margins and having the right capacity. But on the app side, the value starts going in the app layer. And so if you put $3 to $5 billion, and you can't explicitly just monetize the model, the app starts getting a lot of weight and value. And if you actually make sure that you get the app effectively built out, that can be valuable. Right now, what AI is not good at is AI is not good at the last mile just yet.
Yeah.
Right. And in order, like all these arguments that we have around jobs, I actually find in the short to midterm, for sure, and it might even be in the long term, but in the short to midterm, for sure, you're going to have more jobs because of AI, not less. Because every single time there's a step function improvement in AI, you actually have a human bottleneck that comes up. So if you
Right.
can add more value in the app layer, then the model companies might be okay. And then they just continue to keep moving up the stack, which is, by the way, what most kind of technology revolutions, that's what's happened is more and more companies, the profit eventually continues to keep accreting as you move up the stack. And right now, there's also a tremendous amount of opportunity on the infrastructure side to get more efficient. So those are the two areas where you might see explicit monetization occur, and the monetization might not occur as much in the models if open source takes over. I think it's too early to tell. I think it's hard to know definitively that this is the way it's going to go. Also, every model, like if you think about the past 3 years, every single time we felt that, oh my goodness, this company no longer has any chance at success. They
Yeah.
come up with something and all of a sudden they're back in the game. And so
Yeah.
you
I
can't,
have to tell you, I
you
mean,
can't
if you
underestimate that.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, people are down and out on Google's models right now, just because at this moment in time they don't happen to be at the top of the leaderboards We know that Gemini, I think the next version of Gemini, they're being slower to release it. I mean, this is the thing that I think that there could be a comeback here, and I don't think that I don't think the story is so short here in terms of where their models.
Not only
get
there could be a comeback, I can almost guarantee
that's what that's what I think. So I mean, like,
yeah. I mean,
I-
here's the thing: if companies like Google, who have people like Demis, aren't
Yeah.
just sitting idle twiddling their thumbs, they're going to come up with something. By the way, Gemini 3, everyone had given up on Google. Gemini 3 came up. All of a sudden, Google was a cat's meow, which I think it did an amazing job. Then some time goes by, and the next model comes. What I would wish we did more of is start focusing more on the secular shift rather than the micro movements that are happening.
right.
What is the game theory and what the secular shift is going to do? And what is that going to mean for certain workflows and certain business processes and certain automations and certain problems we want to solve? And can we start working on that rather than just talking about the next benchmark? By the way, these evals, they don't mean much anyway, because the evals only go out and assess one thing. Every company is going to need to have their own eval, and the model might perform differently for your company than what it does for a generic benchmark.
And the
So-
models know that they're being evaluated sometimes too.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
So
all right.
it's
Well,
an interesting time.
it is. Jeetu, it's a great conversation. I want to thank you for coming on and having it with us. That is Jeetu Patel, President and Chief Product Officer at Cisco here on TITV. That does it for today's show. A reminder, we are on this stream Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. If you can't make it then, episodes are available on theinformation.com, on our YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to follow us on social media on X, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. I am already excited for our next show tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Bye-bye for now.